Everyone. Hi, so my name's Stephanie. I have absolutely no professional training in biology or ecology or anything. I'm just a very keen amateur really, and I'm really delighted that AWT has asked me to come here tonight and chat to you about my pond, my passion for my pond. So a little bit of background. I grew up with a pond in my garden, and my brother and I used to spend a lot of happy hours peering into its depths at all the tiny creatures and just watching what they were doing. And I thought to myself that when I grew up, I would have a garden with a pond, but it took a while to get there. I lived in London for a long time and then moved to Bristol with 3 sons and a dog. And they're not terribly conducive to gardening. And my back garden was pretty much a mud bath for about 15 years. And so it was in 2014 that I thought it would be a good idea to start having a pond. And so I thought, why are ponds so important? Well, really important for biodiversity. A pond supports an immense number of tiny creatures and larger creatures too, and they can make a big environmental impact with climate change and pollution, as well as being fantastic for wildlife. A really fabulous source of water, particularly in dry periods, really noticeable last summer. But the best thing is that it just gives you an opportunity just to watch nature, in your garden and learn about the things that are going on there. So it was in 2014 that I decided I'd have a go. And you can see the highly sophisticated device that I used to map out the garden. I didn't have any sort of particular size in mind, but the garden seemed to be able to support a pond that was about 144 centimetres long and 90 wide at its widest point. So we just put a hose on the ground to start with, and then we began digging. So I got some of my friends to help me dig the pond, and I don't think I thought it through as well as I might, because of course Bristol's really heavy clay, and we picked a torrential weekend to try digging it. So you can see my 2 friends in this bottom left-hand picture. It was about 50 centimetres, which didn't seem like a lot, but it took us 2 days to dig it, which was a lot, with a lot of help. That's not to say everybody has to have a pond this size, but it was quite effortful at the time. And I'd looked up about the sort of things that you needed and realised that ideally you have different levels in the pond. And I think you can see the shelves, the different shelf levels in that bottom picture. And then we lined it with fleece and then pond lining on top of that. And this is me with the red jacket tucking it in. I don't know if you can see how wet my bottom is, but it was absolutely torrential, and the mud behind it. But I hadn't really appreciated it was a pond that I wanted to attract wildlife to. And so honestly, it was the following morning that I opened the curtains to go to work at about 6 o'clock, and there was this fox just drinking from the pond, which was truly astonishing. So it certainly worked to that degree. Sophie, can you change the next one? Okay, so pond wildlife, having allowed the pond to sort of fill up, which took sort of a day and a half, and then put some stones around the edge and trimmed all the edges. It took less than 2 weeks for newts to find the pond. They were the first creatures that I noticed. Very difficult to photograph in my pond because they love to hide away. But there's one here in the top right. And there were 2 there very swiftly before there was any vegetation at all. And they seemed quite happy. What I realised, these are common newts, smooth or common newts is what they're known as. And they come to the pond to breed, and then they disappear and hang around your garden in dampish places for the rest of the year. And I had to be very careful when I was trimming the grass around the pond, because I'd quite often find newts and frogs in there. And I was very excited a couple of years later when I saw them with beautiful, colourful crests and spots, and thought, oh my goodness me, maybe I've got great crested newts in my pond. But actually it's the breeding colours of the smooth newts, really, really beautiful creatures. Frogs came pretty quickly too, and in March, there's the most amazing scenes. It's like the pond is boiling with frogs, and in this bottom right-hand picture, you can see some frogs spawn in front of some contented frogs. But it just boils. It's extraordinary. And then the other bigger photo shows the little developing frogs, which I think is the most fascinating phase. It's really beautiful, the frog spawn, sort of beautifully lit with all those tiny creatures in it. Frogs, of course, return to the pond to breed again. I think after about a couple of years, they come back to breed. My neighbours have got ponds that are in a slightly sunnier part of their gardens, and their ponds always boil about a fortnight before mine do. And I get a bit nervous that I'm not going to get my frogs back, but they've come back every year. Of course, they're a really good defence against all those slugs attacking my tender new plants. So they do very well. The frog spawn and sometimes occasionally we get toad spawn, but I've only seen that once. We have to be a bit careful because the birds like to eat it, particularly the heron comes and stands by the pond eating the frog spawn. But generally they do very well, and very often there are frogs and toads, particularly after it's been raining, hopping about the garden. So the sort of hidden bit, the pond insects, I'm not very good on pond insects, but we've got a few of them here. The unsung hero, the pond snail, and this lovely pond snail is just under the surface of the water with its, I'm not sure if it's technically called a mouth open, hoovering up little algae in the pond. You can see this is the pondweed on the top of the pond, and that's a tip of an oxygenating bit of plant that it's snuggled up next to. But they're a sign of a healthy pond, and they again just all came by themselves and just tootle about the pond. This creature in the middle, I hope you can see it. It's a little bit difficult, and I noticed it quite recently. I weeded the pond last autumn because it was getting a bit overgrown, and you can see the pond lining in these second two pictures, which also allowed me to be able to see some of the tiny creatures. And this extraordinary thing in the middle is the larvae of a caddisfly, a very unassuming fly, but the larvae build themselves this armor, and this one is carrying the armor. It's built with tiny little bits of twig and also this pondweed that you can see in the first photo. And I noticed it as this bright green little thing bibbling about. So it's not the world's greatest photo, but it's certainly a very interesting thing. There are, we have water boatmen and pond skaters on the top, but these are some of the things underneath. And a lot of other larvae. This one on the right, I think, is the larva of the southern hawker dragonfly. We also have the larvae of damselflies, but then they tend to have 3 lamella at their back end, and they're sort of slimmer than this. So I think that's what it is, but I'd be delighted if anybody wants to correct me on that. And the most extraordinary thing about these larvae is that if you have tall plants in your pond, when they're ready to hatch, after being in water for a couple of years, they climb up the tall plants. And what happens, what I saw a couple of years ago, was the most remarkable thing I think I've ever seen in wildlife, certainly domestically, was this southern hawker dragonfly hatching. And what happens is that the larva climbs up and clings to the tall plant. And then out of the back, the dragonfly pushes itself out and hangs down. And its wings are folded up against its back. You can see its beady eye looking at us in that first one. And then after about an hour, it gets enough strength in its limbs to curl up again and grab the outer casing of the larval shell with its front legs. And then it hangs its tail down, shakes its tail out, hangs its tail down, and gradually over, it was about 5 hours, the wings gradually plumbed up and fleshed out. And then it hangs there as the wings dry out. During that time, is very, very vulnerable to birds in particular coming to it. And you can see in the middle picture that there's another larva behind it that has hatched out. And then this is this beautiful, beautiful dragonfly just hanging there. And I think that is one of the most remarkable feats of nature. as good as anything David Attenborough can produce. It was absolutely astonishing. And then in the third picture, these are common blue damselflies, and they're mating. And we also have red damselflies as well, and two other sorts of butterflies I've seen: broad-bodied chasers and common red darter butterflies. Dragonflies. But we have little red damselflies and the blue ones as well. And they're an absolute treat to see, really fascinating. Next slide, Sophie, please. So the plants in your garden are very important. I ordered native plants right at the beginning from a specialist nursery, which came as little tiny plug plants, but they very quickly grew. And the top one shows the native British iris, with a common carder bee getting pollen from it. The one on the bottom left is a fabulous plant called purple loosestrife, which is a very tall plant, with a European honeybee having fun with it. And then these are two little hoverflies on another plant called it's called pickleweed, this one, and it has little purple flowers. Again, it's a tall one, but also I grow things like water forget-me-not. I've got native white lilies, water lilies, marsh marigolds, and spiked greater spearwort. Water milfoil is the plant that I use for oxygenation, which is the one that you saw the tip of previously. And then in front of the pond, you can see the heron ornament. That's where the pond is. I've grown quite a lot of my lawn long in the last, well, really since just before lockdown, but particularly in lockdown when I didn't have a lawnmower. And so what you can see in this one, the yellow is yellow rattle, which is a very good plant for parasitizing grass and actually gradually getting rid of it. And there's some ragged robin, that's the pink one. There are some taller, some little daisies at the front, and oxeye daisies as well. So if you have lots of plants, you will get a lot of insects and pollinators as well. It's very useful. We also get quite a few birds that come to the pond. And you can see this slightly blurry one. It's quite a long way, and I took it from inside the kitchen. Is a goldfinch coming to have a splash about, and the birds come and bathe and drink. This was taken recently. You can see that's the pond in its winter plumage, not looking so very attractive. But it's a hugely valuable source, and I'm lucky to live near Blaze, the Blaze estate, and get quite a lot of woodland birds to come and have fun in the pond. So hugely important for that. Oh yeah, and there's a green woodpecker that we quite often see in the garden that comes. We do get the great spotted woodpecker as well, and other woodland birds as well. I was given some very tall bulrushes, very generously by a friend, but actually they're much too big for the pond, and sometimes you have to be a little bit careful of those and yellow flag irises. I think that can sometimes take over. And I think since 2014, I've probably weeded the pond 3 times, which is an interesting process without falling in. My husband's got some waders, but we haven't used them yet. And the important thing when you weed the pond is to leave what you've weeded at the edge. And last year I did it in the autumn, and I watched all the little dragonfly larvae sort of scurrying as soon as I lifted it out, just sort of scurrying back into the pond. Which again was good fun. So why have a garden? Why have a garden at all? Well, I would say that although my garden has a reasonably big garden pond for a suburban garden, you can make a pond in anything. You can make it in a bucket, you can make it in a washing up bowl, an old pot, anything that will hold water, because if you do that, undoubtedly things will come. That's the really remarkable thing about the pond, I think, is that you know, after work in particular, coming home and wandering down their garden with a cup of tea or indeed a glass of wine, just sitting there and watching all the insects buzzing and the things swimming around in it, all the life in it is really, it's really fabulous. And I think that, you know, although I think I have been benefiting the local wildlife, there's no doubt that the local wildlife has been benefiting me, really, which is the point of it. I've also done a bit of rewilding of my front garden, which was just a tatty bit of lawn which never saw the sun, mostly by replacing a very old and threadbare privet hedge with some native hedge plants, which are just coming to the fore now. It's its third year now, and also as many pollinating plants as I could stuff in there at the front. So we've got lavender and penstemons, poppies, cosmos, you know, and really, you know, open-headed plants, and some catmint here, with the, I think it's a white-tailed bumblebee, but I think our previous speaker would be probably able to correct me. The very best plant for pollinators, I would say, is borage, which just seeds itself absolutely everywhere all over your garden. You don't need to do anything except buy a few seeds at the beginning. It's an absolutely superb pollinator and very pretty as well, so I recommend it. So really, that's all I have to say is have a go, really. If you haven't got a pond, it will reward you tenfold, but try not to do it on a very wet weekend. Thank you very much.